Welcome to the Veritas Equipping Podcast, a podcast designed to provide insight, resources, and biblical wisdom. Our mission as Veritas Church is raise up mature disciples, send out everyday missionaries, glorify God. Join us as we pursue Jesus to become mature disciples and effective disciple makers for God's glory.
Veritas, welcome back to our Equipping Podcast. We're in the middle of a series on parenting, and we have a special one today. This is week 4, I believe, in our parenting series, and we're here with Garrett and Karlee Hufford. Garrett is one of our elders. Garrett and Karlee have been a part of this church since its conception, serving in a variety of ways, and we're here with kind of a fun, can I say fun topic?
Yeah.
It's definitely a topic that's controversial and needs to be talked about. We're going to talk about discipline when it comes to parenting. So we'll get into that a little bit, but first, guys, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your family?
Okay. We have 10 kids ranging from almost 13 down to 1. So
13 to 1. So you are entering the teen years.
Yep.
We are.
And you got a 1-year-old and the gamut in between.
Yes.
So you are in the thick of the
Yep. We're
of
never
parenting.
ever fully out of a season.
No.
Not yet.
You just get hit with a new one every time somebody turns a birthday. You're like, oh, okay, well,
Yep.
somebody just replaced them.
So you guys have been in seasons or situations where it's not like, oh, if I could go back and we had another 4-year-old, we would do it different. It's like, you got another 4-year-old. So it's like you've learned a lot as you've gone. So what kind of lessons have you learned in parenting, or are you currently learning in parenting?
I think one of the ones that has really stuck with me from Paul David Tripp in his parenting book talks a lot about your job as a parent being an ambassador in your whatever area you're in. And he likens that to if you're an ambassador to another country, your allegiance and your citizenship is somewhere else. So your interests are that of the king or president of the country that sent you, right? And so I think looking at our home not as my kingdom, but as like part of God's kingdom, and I'm just a steward of it, I think is a helpful thing. We can easily, and I mean, God knows I fail in this, thinking like, hey, my home is like my kingdom, it runs the way I want it, and like anything out of step of that can if not handled well.
That's interesting you bring that up. I'm in the middle of trying to write an article right now called Parenting as Stewardship, and just how that changes our perspective. You also referenced a book. As we talk through these parenting conversations in this series, maybe you're like, I need more resources. Soon in our resource center, there'll be the Paul David Tripp book called Parenting, which Garrett just referenced, which is a tremendous resource.
Yeah, if you're ready to, it's not, you open a book like that and you're like, oh, it's about parenting. And you're like, no, it's all about my own heart. And if you want to get wrecked in your own heart on the ways that you let anger control you or whatever, then.
Great endorsement. If you want to get wrecked, like, nah.
I'm good.
I'm good. I'll
super
watch.
helpful.
Let's go
super
Netflix.
helpful.
Yeah. What other lessons do you guys feel like you've learned or are learning?
One that I've learned over and over again is don't get cocky. Because the Lord has a way of humbling you real fast.
Yeah.
And then also, I'd say like right now we're just in a hard season of parenting, and just even remembering like all children are a blessing, even the hard ones. And I think that's just been a good reminder and an ever-present prayer. So
You said don't get cocky. It's so easy. It's like that, that family that has one kid and they're looking at you like, well, it's not hard, guys. What's your problem? And then they have 2 kids and they're like, I'm sorry. Or they have 3 kids like, I thought I knew. I didn't. Like it's a tough job. Yeah, we can always look from a distance and make judgments. It's easy to do.
Yeah. Well, to that point, I think children are a blessing and not a burden. I do feel like in our culture, children sometimes tend to get placed in that burden category. It's like, hey, you've got them for 18 years, and then thank God when they leave, as opposed to like, hey, these are this is a blessing from the Lord. And that doesn't always mean that they're going to be wonderful, but they're for your flourishing, they're for your good, and they're for God's glory.
Oh.
And so,
and sometimes I think making the dichotomy of they're not a burden, they're a blessing, and be like, well, they're both. And it's like they're a blessing, and they change your life. They're an inconvenience. They infringe on your freedom, and in a lot of ways.
I was thinking one other, as I was kind of thinking through these questions we were going to walk through. I think there's a sense too, like, we don't need to give our kids everything that they want. Our job is to give them everything they need. And just thinking through that, I said, you don't need an extraordinary life to have extraordinary kids. You need an extraordinary God. You need an extraordinary God. And that sense of, I think there's a sense of like, I need to be able to give my kids every opportunity, everything in this world, when it's like, hey, the only thing they need is God. Because I feel like you think like, oh, I can't really parent well unless like I have all the money to be able to do these X, Y, and Z, or all the opportunities to do X, Y, and Z. When it's like, hey, you've been given everything you need for life and godliness, and just because you're a Christian.
Yeah. So. And it's a good in our nature that we want to provide for our kids, because all they need is God, and fed and clothed and disciplined, like all these things in raising a child. But the experiences we want to give them, I feel like parents connecting this to what it means to love their kids really want them to be experientially rich. So my kids are going to be in karate, and they're going to be in sports, and they're going to do the math club, and they're going to go to this vacation, and they're going to go on this vacation. And I want to give my kids the most experiences I possibly can, but they're very relationally poor. Right. So it's kind of like, what are you valuing? If you just kind of shove your kid in a lot of different things and you think this is how I'm giving them the best upbringing, but it's like you don't have lasting relationships in their life. They don't know anybody deeply. They're not plugged into a local church or have that kind of community. So it's kind of what we value and what we're giving to. Are you giving your kids a relationship with God, a relationship in community, or is it karate or soccer, or like, and it's not always an either or, but they can end up competing. Yeah. So let's get into it. Let's jump right into the fun, non-controversial topic of discipline. First off, let me just ask, why do you guys think this is a controversial topic?
I think as a mom, you walk out into the world and you're just judged. You're judged if you do, you're judged if you don't. I'd use other words if I could. But yeah, so even like just a simple trip to the store, if your kid's having a bad day and you're like, I have to go through the store, you're judged because your kid's having a bad day and what you do as a parent. Even just that, like, small little aspect of it, you just feel judged by everyone.
I think also there's a misunderstanding of what our role is as parents, as like authority figures in our kids' lives versus their friend. And I think when you're a friend, you're like, there's a different sense of like how I relate to you versus if I'm like your God-given authority. And that, again, authority can be abused, but authority is not bad, right? Especially for a child who doesn't know anything, doesn't know their own way, doesn't know boundaries. Like, you're given to your children in order to help them see boundaries. And I think even there's a lot of good things that God has given us. And I think you used the analogy of like fire in like a fireplace or in a fire pit versus like in a forest, right? There's that sense of one of my jobs is to like help them understand the boundaries that God has set for us. And like, that is discipline. And you helped me kind of understand like the difference between like discipline and punishment, right? So I think we only associate the punishment piece of it versus discipline actually like encompasses your family values, like how you like functionally like show
it's for
people
your
in
good.
your home.
It's for your good.
Yeah. Where a punishment might be more retaliation than instruction or correction. For sure. You guys, you mentioned going to the store. Like, just stories are coming to my mind. Like, we could do a whole other podcast of just discipline adventures with our kids. But we've been there. So let me jump into some of the controversy. Do you spank now, and were you spanked as a child?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes.
So your experience of that kind of discipline didn't turn you off to then carrying it out to your kids?
I felt like it was a good tool for the time that it was used. It wasn't like I wasn't 18 getting spanked by my dad. It was very, and I can remember the times that some of the times that I got spanked, and I deserved to be spanked. And I knew like that my dad or my mom, they still loved me, and that it was for like my good. And I knew when I was doing what I was doing too, that I was probably going to get spanked.
Why do you think the topic of, because so many people in previous generations are like, well, yeah, of course. Like, why do you think it's a controversial topic now?
I do think that there is a sense of it's been abused, right?
So seeing abuses of.
Yeah. And so then you kind of like throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because I think we only focus on spanking so often, but I would lump it all in with just like physical discipline, right? So like in the store, one of the things that Karlee
and
I
I
do,
would
like,
even say though, go as far as to say like screaming at your kids,
right.
Like, but
like
that
verbal abuse, physical abuse,
Yes.
so the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And studies that I've seen, they do lump that in spanking as in a loving way is in the same category as the dad who comes home drunk and hits his kid. Like, so they don't really specify the differences of the loving instruction laid out in spanking.
Because even like we talk about going to the store, like we pinch our kids. So like on on their thigh, right? So I'm not gonna like take them out of the cart and like just start like spanking them there. Because I also like one of the things with spanking is I always try to, hey, it's always followed up with discussion.
Yeah.
Right. It's always followed up with something. It's not not on an island by itself, but also like slapping their hand or flicking their mouth or like those kind of things where for like really young kids, it is a formative piece. Like they can only understand like those physical things. So
it's interesting. One of the controversies you talked earlier about just feeling judged, like even when we start to talk about, the practical levels of how we discipline, when we're in the store, when we're at home, there's this social threat of like, is somebody going to think that I'm abusing my kids? Does somebody think that I don't love my kids? But then you get into the scripture and it's like those who spare the rod hate their children. So it's like, it is a loving that God disciplines those he loves. So it's that like, how am I going to be judged by this or what's the society going to perceive?
Yeah. I just always think of like Psalm 23. It says like your rod and your staff comfort me, and just that like thinking of myself as a sheep.
sometimes like,
You're just like sometimes you kind of need to whack on the head, and sometimes you need to be dragged, right?
Yes.
Like there's like both ends of it.
So in scripture, we do one thing that I feel like you can't debate is discipline is a good thing. So self-discipline is a fruit of the Spirit. Like that should exist in our lives. Discipline from a parent, we referenced, there's tons of Proverbs that talk about the need to discipline your kids. Ephesians 6:4, I believe, talks about fathers, bring up your kids in the instruction of the Lord. Then you have government discipline, like governments in our life to punish those who do evil, Romans 13. And then you talk about God and his discipline, that God disciplines us for our good. Hebrews 12, we just got done talking about that as a church. So discipline is a good thing that's needed in our life. The one about disciplining for parents to kids does come with a promise that you have.
Live long life in the land.
Yeah, like this is going to go well with you if you do this. Or even in a negative sense, like if you don't discipline your kid, there's a Proverbs like he's going to be a disgrace to his mother. Like there's a sense of, hey, there's going to be consequences if you don't discipline. And then you also get in the Proverbs over and over again how the wise embrace discipline. and if you reject it, you're stupid. Is what it
He
says.
literally says stupid.
Yeah.
So,
So that's a direct quote. So discipline is a good thing that should be embraced. So let's get into the practical nature of this when it comes to parents disciplining their kids. What are some pieces of advice or instruction that you'd give parents today when it comes to discipline?
I think, first of all, it has to be informed, especially from a Christian standpoint. It has to be informed by the gospel, first and foremost. Like, that has to be front of mind. I was just writing down, like, some of my thoughts, and it's like, my job is not to create change, but to be an instrument of change in the hands of the one who can change, right? So, similarly, we exercise authority as one who is under authority. And I think just having a humility about my own discipline of my kids, and I think that helps. That helps with just a sense of, hey, if my worship is off, then the way that I discipline is for sure going to be off, right? Because if I'm all focused on self and my own comfort and my own like control, and then something like butts up against that in my home, like that's when like my kids like feel like the wrath, right? Like It's like, you butted up against my idol, like now you get to pay the punishment, versus if I'm really looking to who Christ is and looking to like, I think that's where that perspective of having the gospel at the forefront that we talk about, like preaching the gospel to ourselves. You know, Karlee mentioned it, we've been going through some difficult parenting things, and it's like, we have to keep like just like saying how like God's been faithful to us. How does God treat us? God doesn't keep us at arm's length. God does, all of these things, and fear isn't a good motivator for change in your kids, For
Yeah,
sure.
well, and I even try to remind the kids over and over again, like, and they'll kind of breathe a sigh when I ask them, I'm like, why do we discipline you? And they're like, because you love us, but it's like, I want them to know, like, I don't like get some enjoyment out of like disciplining them. It's because I love them. I would prefer not to have to do it. But it's necessary for them and it's necessary for me. So
it can seem like one of the biggest things that get into the way of parents disciplining their kids is laziness. Like follow through is harder. I don't really want to deal with this right now. I have other things going on. And I just say, like, parents, you have nothing more important going on right now than raising your kids to know and love and obey Jesus. And discipline is a good thing that needs to be embraced. But it's difficult. I had a long day. I just fine and do it. I'm not going to deal with it right now.
And also, we were talking about it before the podcast, but like, if you say you're going to do something, do it. Like, follow through. Even in the most simple things, it's like, hey, if this happens, like, that's going to directly affect this thing for a week. And you're like, I literally put reminders in my phone because otherwise I will forget.
Yeah.
Right?
If you said no snacks before dinner, and then they have a snack, and your reaction is like, oh, well, you just taught them something, and it was that they can disobey. If you want to say snacks before dinner, that's fine, then fine. But if you said it, you got to follow through. Yeah. You got to follow through. What other lessons, or not lessons, just like advice when you look at parenting and implementing discipline?
Also, it kind of goes with the laziness, but don't count. Like,
all right, so this
that
could
might be like a pet peeve of mine.
All right, so this is, some parents do it, some parents don't. You got this idea of like delayed obedience is disobedience, counting. Other people are like, all right, I'm giving you 5 seconds to make a better decision. You think about this. How do you guys view counting?
I view counting is that they will always wait till 5.
Yeah.
Like, they literally
well, and then they kind of give you like that little like smile, like, oh, I'm gonna run and do it, like stop jumping on the couch. I'm gonna give you to the count of 5, or
and then it's 10. Like 4, 4.5, 4 3/4. Like, you don't want to do anything about this.
But I do think it's a difference when you're like honestly hoping that your child makes a different decision without like specifically saying like, I'm going to count, but like, hey, think before you make that choice. Even just saying that, think before you make that choice. and then you have to follow through with whatever.
Yeah. Sometimes, especially young kids, where the impact of discipline from 0 to 3 is huge. Almost like if you miss that window, you got an uphill battle for a long time. But they're so cute, and I love them, and I don't want them to associate me with bad things because you're having these bonding moments. Let me read a proverb from it says Proverbs 22:15. It says, "Folly is bound up in the heart of the child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far away." Your kid, and you should know this, as cute as your kids are, they're sinners. And a 2-year-old's not going to come to the best conclusion on their own. They need help and they need instruction. So one of the things I just tell parents is embrace it. They need it. And if you don't give it, especially in those early years, it's going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah, and what I think with you were talking about
The proverb?
Yeah. So just that, like that is a necessity that you need to provide for your kids.
You look at your kid and say, folly is bound up in you. Like that's a biblical truth.
Yeah, and I think sometimes parents get frustrated when you may ask them, like, why did you do that? And they're like, I don't know. And really, in all honesty, sometimes they may actually be being honest. It's like, I just did it, right? And I think it's my job as a parent. I got my train of thought back. It's my job as a parent to help you understand why you did that, right? So my job is to help you understand sin, understand your own heart and like what can come from it, and to like help you see Jesus in it. Like that's as a Christian parent to walk them through that and not see that as like an antagonistic thing primarily. Sometimes kids are just turds, but
and they need discipline.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's this fear of like, I'm going to scar my kid. If you're abusive, certainly you got problems, but discipline and even forms of physical discipline, don't lump that all in with abuse. Proverbs 23, he says, "Do not withhold discipline from a child, for if you punish them with the rod, they will not die." Punish them with the rod and save them from death. Like there's a sense of, hey, you're not gonna kill your kid here, but if you don't discipline, you are gonna scar them in ways that may not be physically evident, but are emotionally and behavioral evident as they get older. Other profound points of wisdom. I'm just jumping in all the time. I'm sorry. You guys spill your wisdom.
Probably something that I have learned is don't accuse either. Like,
so hard.
Yeah. 'Cause
so hard.
That's the podcast right here in parenting. Just Garrett soundbite. Oh, it's so hard.
I know.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like the things that like I have learned, but like don't accuse, be quick to apologize when I am wrong. And also one thing that I am like very like I am conscious that I'm doing it now, but I would always be like, I'm sorry, but like if I like they were doing something and they provoked me, and so then I'm like, I'm sorry for yelling, but I wouldn't have yelled if you wouldn't have been doing, like I would get into that. And it's like, no, I need to ask for forgiveness. And then maybe at a little bit later of a time, just say, hey, but what you were doing was still not okay. And so let's talk about that and deal with that separately instead of doing I just feel like it's not a sincere apology, and not out of humility of like, hey, I shouldn't have done that. Can you please forgive me? And then later on, like, we should not have been running around screaming at the top of our lungs while everybody was trying to nap or, stuff like that.
And one of the best things that we can do as parents is to model those things, right? Model like humility. Model that sense of like, I was wrong. I'm also a sinner. So lest you think that I'm like just coming after you, like I'm also a sinner. I struggle with the same things that you struggled with, right? And like they just manifest themselves a little bit differently. I need Jesus too. And like we're in this together, but like I'm here to help you along because I'm further along, right? And I think that's a helpful thing.
So hard. There's a sense where you do wear different hats in the sense of like, okay, I've been put in a position to raise you and discipline you and raise you in the instructions of the Lord. So I'm your parent on one hand. On another hand, I'm a fellow sinner, struggler in this world. If your kids become Christians, that's another hat. It's like you're also my brother or sister in Christ, and or my son and daughter. Like there's different hats that you wear in those situations.
Well, and to not be surprised necessarily by your kids as well. Like we shouldn't be surprised that our kids like push back on our discipline when we push back on the discipline of God on our lives, and like we should expect that. and then but when we do that, God treats us with grace, and we just tend to lash out. Right. So I think that's where like really taking our cues on parenting of like, how does God treat us? Right. I think that's
and when they're that young, when you talked about even just brain development, there's certain ages you can't reason or logic or explain something. Right. You just need to lay a foundation of obedience that later you build upon as they get older. Right. But if you don't lay that foundation and you're just trying to like reason with your 2-year-old, it's like
it's not going to happen.
You're going to build a house on sand, and when they turn 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, it's sinking. So it's do the hard work early. You mentioned earlier, like sometimes the trap parents fall into is I just want to be my kid's friend. And I would say that's a good aspiration that someday we would be friends as adults. Like right now with the 19-year-old, a 16-year-old, like we love spending time with them. They're friends, but you got to do the hard work of discipline early to enjoy friendship with your kids later. If you try to be friends with your 3-year-old, I'm gonna say you need better friends. That's not the time. Be a parent, and if you do the hard work early, you'll enjoy friendship with your kids later, which is it's a blessing.
Well, I keep thinking too of like just the like social media world that we live in. I do think sometimes we can have a skewed perspective of what our kids are to us, and they can kind of almost be like, hey, they're almost like a living doll, almost, if you will. That sense of, hey, like they are a projection of me, right? And so I think we try to sugarcoat those things and try to gloss over things because we think actually it really does reflect us, and to some extent it does. But you're gonna see the fruit of that later down the road, as opposed to at that time when it really should have just been a focus on, hey, first time obedience. I mean, that's not a hard thing, but it's hard. But I would say it's simple but not easy. Yeah. I think especially that's why I feel like God has us start out little, because it's like, hey, we can gradually progress there, and I'm not given life at an 18-year-old where it's like I've got my own will and my own desires and my own things that I want to do, and but like it's a blessing that they start young, and we can walk through those stages together with them.
For sure. So guys, in closing here, what's one word of encouragement or practical advice when it comes to discipline that you'd want to leave parents with that are listening?
I think one quote that Karlee and I always talk about, G.K. Chesterton said, "The most extraordinary thing in the world is two ordinary parents raising their ordinary kids." And I think that's always kind of stuck with me, because I think in a world that just screams be extraordinary, that like the normal things of life, which I lump like discipline into that thing, I think can sometimes be side skirted for for the extraordinary life, right? All the things that we're doing, and you actually don't end up spending enough time with your kids to really see their flaws in some ways, and that quantity or that quality time that you say you want actually ends up being a function more of quantity time. Like we always want that profound conversation with our kids, right? But it doesn't really happen unless I'm just there.
Yeah. Oh, you're going to get me on my Walter Mitty rant. I love Secret Life of Walter Mitty. It's a movie, but it just, sometimes we're wanting this extravagant, it's got to be a deep conversation with my kids. It's got to be this great experience with my kids instead of just the beautifulness of just everyday, simple faithfulness.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that, I would say out of just functionality, because we have so many kids, going places and lavish trips. Not that those are wrong, but they're very expensive and we just can't afford to do it and don't try to put our money towards that. So it's just I think it's overlooked of just giving your kids a stable, ordinary life. If you came over to our house, there's nothing extraordinary about it. It's very just kind of mundane, our day-to-day life, but I love that. And I hope and I pray that when our kids get older that they would see what a gift that was to them, of just even there's less distractions, less places to go for them, so they play outside, they talk to each other, they hang out, they play board games. I mean, they do fight, but just those things.
I would say the same thing about our house, except if you did come over during a family dance party, it's pretty extraordinary.
Oh yeah, so that's fair.
There's glimpses of extraordinary in our house.
I think one last thing that I was thinking was, well, there's
so
that.
hard. It's hard. Guys, parenting is hard. It's so hard. This is the soundbite. So hard. It's so hard. We stayed at a pretty 30,000 foot level when it comes to discipline and principles. And this is an issue that you probably want to get practical with. How do I do this? What does it look like? I would encourage you, don't parent in private or parent alone. You're in a connection group or community. Talk with other brothers and sisters in Christ. Be open with how you discipline, your struggles in it. Sharpen each other in that. As a church, we want to be a help to you. So if you're just feeling my kid's out of control, I can't get my kid to behave, we want to help you. Reach out to one of us here at Veritas, and we'd love to come alongside and pray with you, encourage you, get practical in any way that we can. Hopefully this podcast and this series is helpful in this journey, because the most important thing in raising kids is not just functioning adults, but disciples. And that's what we want to see. We love you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Veritas Equipping Podcast. If you have any questions you would like us to address or ideas on how we can serve you better, please reach out to us by email at info@veritascr.church and put podcast in the subject line.